Get him out of my building now." The words cut clean through the marble lobby, sharp and final, as Edward Whitmore didn't even bother to look up from his phone. Just a flick of his hand like Marcus Reed was nothing more than a smudge on glass. And within seconds, 2 security guards were already moving, their polished shoes echoing across the floor as they closed in on Marcus, who stood there in a worn work jacket, fingers still lightly smudged with grease, eyes steady but quiet, like he had already seen this moment coming. Like he understood something no one else in that room did. And as they reached for his arm, Marcus took a slow breath and said, almost under it, "Sir, if I leave now, you're going to wish I didn't." But Edward just exhaled a faint, dismissive laugh, already turning away, already choosing not to hear the warning that would soon cost him everything. Marcus did not resist as they guided him toward the glass doors, his boots leaving faint marks against the polished floor that reflected more light than warmth. And for a brief second, he glanced back not at the guards, not at the crowd that had already begun to whisper, but at the ceiling above the lobby where the recessed lighting flickered almost too subtly for anyone else to notice, like a pulse out of rhythm. And he knew that pattern because he had spent the last 12 years fixing systems just like this one in buildings no one ever remembered until something failed. Long nights, tight spaces, heat trapped behind metal panels, learning to read problems before they became disasters. But here, in a place where suits cost more than his monthly rent and silence meant obedience, he was just another contractor who did not belong, another man people assumed could be replaced without consequence. And as the doors opened and the cool outside air brushed his face, Marcus paused for half a breath, not out of hesitation but certainty, because he had already traced the fault in his mind, already measured how long it would take before the first sign showed itself. And inside, Edward Whitmore was already moving on, already trusting a system he never truly understood. The glass doors closed behind Marcus with a soft seal, but inside, the tension did not fade. It sharpened, because a few heads near the reception desk had already turned, not with concern but with quiet amusement, and one of the junior executives leaned toward another, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite while still being heard, saying something about how people like that always tried to act like they knew more than they did. And a brief ripple of restrained laughter moved through the group, subtle but unmistakable, while Edward Whitmore finally lifted his gaze, not to reconsider, but to dismiss, his expression tightening with mild irritation as if the entire interruption had been an inconvenience beneath him. And he spoke just loud enough for those closest to hear. "Next time, make sure we vet who we let in here." His tone cool, controlled, practiced, the kind that did not need to raise volume to carry authority, and the room responded accordingly, a few nods, a few faint smiles, a collective agreement that whatever Marcus had tried to say was not worth hearing. And above them, unseen, the lights flickered again, slightly longer this time, a quiet signal swallowed by polished confidence and the assumption that nothing important had just walked out the door. The first sign was almost polite, a soft dimming across the ceiling lights that made a few people glance up for less than a second before returning to their conversations. But then the air shifted, not in temperature but in rhythm, like something unseen had fallen out of sync, and a faint hum began to rise from the walls, low and uneven, as if the building itself was trying to correct a mistake it did not fully understand. And one of the assistants tapped her tablet, frowning as the connection lagged, her screen freezing mid-swipe, while across the lobby a digital display flickered twice before going dark entirely. And that was when the murmur started, no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but edged with uncertainty, and Edward Whitmore noticed it too, his posture tightening slightly as he turned toward the reception desk, asking for a status update that did not come quickly enough, because the system that was supposed to answer him was already struggling, already slipping, and somewhere deeper in the building, beyond the reach of polished surfaces and controlled voices, a breaker hesitated under a load it was never meant to carry, and outside, just beyond the glass, Marcus Reed had not walked far. He stood near the curb, eyes lifting once toward the upper floors, measuring the seconds in silence, knowing exactly how close they were to a failure no one inside was prepared to face. And inside, the pressure kept building, invisible but undeniable, like a storm gathering behind walls no one thought could crack. The hum grew louder, no longer something that could be ignored. And one of the senior engineers rushed across the lobby, his tablet clutched tightly in his hand, stopping just short of Edward Whitmore with a look that did not match the calm the room was trying to maintain. And he said quietly but firmly, "Sir, the load is not stabilizing." And for the first time, Edward did not respond immediately, his eyes flicking toward the darkened display, then toward the ceiling lights that flickered. Again, longer this time, stretching the silence thin, and that was when he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if something was trying to surface in his memory, something about a voice, a warning, a man he had already dismissed, and outside, through the glass, Marcus Reed remained still, his gaze steady, not angry, not rushed, just waiting, as if he already knew the exact moment they would realize they needed the one person they chose to ignore. The engineer's voice lowered further as more alerts began stacking across his screen, lines of red warnings replacing the clean interface they all trusted, and he swallowed once before saying, "Sir, this is not just a fluctuation. Something is rerouting the load incorrectly." And Edward Whitmore's jaw tightened as he stepped closer, taking the tablet without asking, his eyes scanning numbers that meant control, that meant certainty. Except now they did not align, they did not behave, and behind him the lobby had shifted completely, conversations fading into uneasy silence as employees glanced at one another, waiting for someone to explain what was happening, while the lights overhead flickered again, longer, dimmer, casting uneven shadows across the marble floor that once reflected confidence but now carried doubt. And Edward's fingers paused mid-scroll as a small detail caught his attention. A manual override flag buried deep in the system log, something that should not have been. Triggered automatically, something that required human recognition, human foresight, and for a brief second, the memory surfaced clearer this time. A calm voice, steady, unshaken. "There is something wrong with your system." And Edward blinked slowly, his breath tightening as he realized that warning had not been a guess. It had been precise, intentional, informed, and across the room, the same junior executive who had laughed earlier now stood stiff, no longer smiling, watching the screens fail one by one, while outside, beyond the glass, Marcus Reed remained where he had been, hands resting at his sides, not pacing, not checking his phone, just present, like someone who had already calculated every outcome. And inside, Edward felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty, not fear yet, but recognition, the quiet, undeniable sense that the mistake had already been made, and it was bigger than pride. Edward Whitmore turned sharply toward the glass doors, the movement no longer controlled, no longer measured, and for the first time since the lights began to fail, he stepped away from the center of the room, as if authority itself had shifted out of his reach. And when the doors opened again, the cool air rushed in, carrying the quiet stillness outside where Marcus Reed stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, unmoved. And Edward stopped a few feet from him, the distance suddenly heavier than any boardroom silence, his voice lower now, stripped of command as he said, "You knew." And Marcus met his gaze without tension, without triumph, just a calm certainty that made the truth land harder than any accusation. And slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn but official credential, not flashy, not designed to impress, but unmistakable. A certified systems specialist authorization issued for critical infrastructure oversight, the kind of clearance granted to those trusted to prevent failures before they happen. And Edward's eyes locked onto it, the realization settling in piece by piece, because this was not a guess, not luck, this was expertise he had dismissed, a solution he had ordered out. And behind him, through the glass, the building flickered again, as if confirming the cost of that decision in real time. Marcus did not move to hand over control right away. He simply looked past Edward for a moment, toward the building that was now dimming floor by floor, each flicker a quiet reminder of what had been ignored. And inside, executives who once stood tall now hovered near dead screens, waiting, uncertain, while the authority that once filled the space had thinned into silence. And Edward felt it, not just the failure of the system, but the weight of his decision settling in, heavy and undeniable, because the cost was no longer hidden behind confidence. It was visible in every darkened panel, every unanswered command. And when Marcus finally stepped forward, It was not with urgency or pride, but with calm purpose, the kind that did not need recognition to prove its worth. And in that moment, the truth landed fully. Not all mistakes come from lack of knowledge. Some come from choosing not to listen.